Okay, I think we're recording, and I'm very pleased to have my friend Mac Thompson back on the program. How you doing, Mac? It's been a few weeks.
Hanging in there. Thanks for having me back. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to tell y'all more about this stuff.
Yeah, and
These sled
this
dog.
stuff, yeah, this sled dog racing industry, which I didn't know much about. And so just to catch people up, Mac Thompson was already on the program. I'm going to put a link to the first conversation that we had. But Mac Thompson came to me with his stories about his time in the sled dog racing industry up in Minnesota, um, which is something that me, based in the eastern southern United States, didn't know a whole lot about. And you described really miserable conditions, and I'll just say, Mac, from the start that you really honed in on the story of Olive, which is a dog that you seem to take like you seem to care a lot about all of these dogs, but you really took a liking to Olive, and you told me this really upsetting story about Olive basically being run to such exhaustion that she collapsed. Um, I found that to be a really moving story, and well, I'll just start, Mac, by saying thank you for bringing that story to our attention. And we wanted to talk more about the topic because we really didn't get to everything that we wanted to talk about, including some of the history of the sport. Now, you spent, I think, what, 3 years in the industry, and you got to see a lot of different things. And you've also sort of been researching more and more about the sled dog racing industry. But why don't you kick us off by talking a little bit about what you've been looking into, even over the past few days?
Um, well, in preparation to this conversation, I've just kind of been trying to refresh myself and get it fresh in my head. Um, but the history of dog sled racing isn't particularly old. It's mostly happened over the past not even 100 years. Like some of these races, like ONAC and Laconia, claim to be pretty old, but they were long periods where the races didn't go on and things like that. But the racing industry, as we know it, really started in the late 60s, early 70s. The first Iditarod was in like 1972. So this is all a really recent phenomenon, and uh, it it's really ugly now, and I feel like it has an ugly history, and you can just kind of it's since it hasn't been going on that long, you can kind of look at the whole thing in isolation
Mhm.
and remove some of the variables and stuff that might kind of I feel like it's a pretty easy thing to look at, and especially since it doesn't take place over a long history.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I sort of look at it in the paradigm of just how we've always used animals, and how we use animals for entertainment, like whether it's horse racing or bullfighting or the rodeo, all these different ways that we just take animals and do with them what we want. And you were describing conditions that you said were, you know, by the industry standard, maybe even above average. And they were still pretty miserable for the dogs. So the dogs lose in this situation. I mean, you've also looked at how the sled dog racing industry has ties to colonialism and the trapping industry. And what can you tell me about that?
Um, I'll try. I'll do my best to give this topic the care and consideration it deserves. I'm not a historian by any means. I've just worked a lot with animals, but in doing that, it's made me wonder a lot about how people used to do it. Look at maybe archaic forms of animal control and animal husbandry, and how that stuff goes on. because humans have lived with animals for thousands of years, and we've had these relationships, and I think we can attribute a lot of our success as a species to our relationship with some of these animals, and it really is a shame that they aren't there. Their quality of life seems to have gone down as ours seems to have gone up. And I feel like the sled dog industry is a really great example of that. If you look at how sled dogs lived in the Arctic, there have been people continuously inhabiting the Arctic for thousands of years. I think we have fossil evidence that shows human habitation in this very barren and extreme landscape 10,000 years old. And I'm not sure that manner of life is even possible without the dogs. So they've always been there, and you have records of and oral history, and we know that they had dogs in Siberia and Russia and stuff. So dogs have always been with us, and I think maybe we get lost in the sauce a little bit with selective breeding and how we've kind of developed these dogs as a technology. And you can see that really well with how the dogs lived in these indigenous communities for thousands of years versus when like Alaska and the Arctic were colonized in this last 100 years, because you have a budding of two different ways of life, and you can see how you can really observe how the lifestyles of the dogs have changed and how the roles have had to change, and it's just a really interesting area to look into so many of these different problems we face. But with the sled dogs in indigenous communities, these cultures they live, like I said, it's a very, very extreme environment. Their entire society was built with leather, bone, stone, and driftwood mostly. I think there's some evidence of like maybe meteoric metals and stuff, but like where are you going to get it? But these cultures not just scraped by, but they thrived off this. I'm not trying to say it was like a bad thing, but how did their dogs live? They weren't on chains. They didn't have chains. The dogs, where are they going to run off to? You can look off in every direction, and it's just a flat field of ice in every direction in some of these parts of the Arctic. There actually is a variety in that. I'm certainly not an expert, but the dogs weren't these like prisoners, and they did a lot more than just pull a sled. Like the term sled dog almost seems to be a misnomer, that because they used the dogs to survive in every single way. Like there's polar bears in the Arctic, and having dogs running around your village to bark at the bears and keep the bears away is extremely useful all on its own, even without them pulling a sled. And to find the seals, like the dogs have the nose and they can find the seals, but the dog could never catch the seal, but the human can. And it's this relationship between the two that made life possible. And it's as things have progressed, it was laws infringed upon in these communities where they were required to chain the dogs. And it's a really ugly part of history when you look at the RCMP sled dog killings and that whole transition in the way of life.
Yeah. And so now we think you go to a sled dog racing breeder or team, they're all on these chains. And you showed us last time what it looked like at the place that you worked, and they were just all chained up, and they had like a small circle of of area to run around in, and it was just a miserable existence, and not really even much shelter either, if any, right? I mean, like, not much protection from the elements.
No, and it's there's a lot of really interesting stuff. There was this one like documentary thing. It was called Ice Dogs. I don't remember what year it came out, but it's not that old. And in the first few minutes of the film is a dog giving birth on a gang line in the Arctic, and its puppies freezing to death. It's wild, and like the mom, it's like the little puppy sickles. It's like that's quite a way to start a documentary. But that whole a gang line is that's the thing on the sled that all the dogs are hooked to. But what I'm more referring to is when it's a chain that's stuck to the ground, and you can clip all the dogs to that chain. Since everything's like ice and snow and stuff, the posts don't really work, so they do these other systems. So they have these dogs just like chained to this chain on the ground, and no dog houses, no nothing. And these dogs have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. Like there is a survival of the fittest element to it. I don't want to over romanticize or put it on a pedestal. There's certainly a pretty hardcore side to that. But in terms of quality of life, like if that dog wasn't chained to a gang line, it could have moved. It could have dug a hole in the snow. It could have found somewhere where it wasn't in the wind. Like it wouldn't have that. We might have not had those puppy sickles if it wasn't for the gang line. It's like, why is the dog on the gang line? And that ties back into this RCMP thing, because I'm talking about like indigenous communities and like, you know, the cost of straw, the cost of, they don't use chains up there as much. They use that like coated metal, like kind of laundry line stuff I see commonly used up there. They'll use a chain for like the gang line, like the tie out, but then I don't know, everybody does it differently, but everything's really expensive, like the dog food and straw, like wood to build dog houses. So yeah, like the dogs don't have dog houses. And PETA in one of their undercover videos has a video, and they're like, oh, she doesn't even, this poor dog won the Iditarod, and here she is wasting away on the beach of the frozen ocean without a doghouse. And it's like, yeah, they didn't, the dog didn't have a doghouse. And just a fun fact about that, the Barack Obama's been to that kennel. Just like I said, just a fun fact. I mean, it's not Barack Obama. He's just doing diplomacy and stuff. But you have PETA recording this video that everybody, the comment section doesn't have anybody like defending it. They're like, oh my God, this is awful. You know how people like to troll in PETA's comment sections, but everybody is like, oh yeah, this is terrible. And then you can look and you can find a video of like Barack Obama there, like looking at puppies and, you know, like checking out a sled. Oh, wow.
What was he doing there? He was just checking it out.
Yeah, you can't, this is a really extremely remote community. This is, I don't remember the name of it right offhand, but I don't even think there's a road to this place. Maybe like they used to have an ice road. I think a lot of the ice roads aren't maintained or used anymore. That's like a lot less of a thing than it used to be. But this is like an extremely remote community that you can't like drive to. And so Barack Obama was out there, and they had an Iditarod winter in town, so they went out to the kennel. But I just think that's a really interesting like dichotomy there, because you have this, it's like really grungy looking, ratty, falling in sled dog boxes, pretty normal stuff. But and they're probably a little bit rattier than someone in the mainland. And that's another thing. What I was talking about is the material conditions aspect at play here. Like a lot of people have a link to sled dogs and life in the Arctic, Inuit type of stuff. But these communities, these really rural indigenous communities, can't really excel in racing because they don't have the same access to feed and straw and dogs and everything. It's just way more expensive, and it's a lot more limiting in lots of ways to be in one of these small villages. So I don't know how much benefit a race like the Iditarod offers to the villages. And
So who does benefit?
I'm not sure anybody benefit. I guess there's a few of the mushers who do, like they're basically these puppy milling operations. And that's one thing about racing, I think, that's hard to get across. It's like a bad habit for a lot of people. It's something that you can really sink a lot of time and money into, and you win. It's kind of like, it's like building a race car in your backyard. Putting together a team of sled dogs is like a time investment. But like, you do have people like the CVs and the Streepers and Kings and these large kennels. There's several of them, and they breed a lot of dogs. You can sell a few good dogs and make a lot of money. We sold a dog. The most money I've ever seen a dog sell for was $8,000. Like, and that dog was not worth that much money. It was worth that much money to that person. And there's kind of like a demeasuring contest element to that stuff. But I totally forgot where I'm so far away from where I was.
Well, I'm just curious because you were describing these very remote areas.
Oh yeah, and how just those guys can't compete. That was what I was saying. Sorry.
Yeah. What about the place where you were working, where you were in Minnesota? What kind of place was that? Was that pretty remote?
It was like, compared to you're from the same part of the world here, and we like to fancy there being like kind of rural country stuff around here, but nothing like the Midwest and like Canada and stuff, like where the Alaska highway, like you can drive for like 400 miles and not see anything. like really remote. Some of these towns are just like really far out there, more than I'm used to. But the way it's all set up now, everywhere's got like a Dollar General or a Walmart or whatever, so it's never feels that bad. But when you're in those, not on the Alaska highway, but in Minnesota, the material conditions for dog sled racing are pretty ideal. Maybe not as much snow as like you get in like Michigan, but it gets plenty cold enough, and there's a lot of animal agriculture, so like the beef is cheap for the dog food and stuff. It's probably one of the better places in the lower 48 for sled dog racing.
Yeah, what is the incentive? Because it sounds like there's some money for someone like who you are working for, but it doesn't sound like a lot. It sounds like they could
I'm
easily
not
do something
sure
else.
how much money the guy I worked for made. Like, I know he made some, like I said, I described him selling a dog for $8,000, but those types of kennels, like the 30, you can turn it into something profitable, I guess. But for a lot of people, it's a bad habit. Like that, like there's a guy, I think I told the story about the guy with the cigarette at the multi-start race. And like that guy, I think part of the reason he had such a bad attitude is because he wanted to race more and he just couldn't. He couldn't like afford to do it. So he had to sell sled dog rides like most of the season. And if you're selling sled dog rides to get by, you don't have time to race and travel to go to races and stuff because it's sled dog ride season. So that's why some of these really large kennels have so much success, because they have so many extra dogs. They can just allocate them and they can just F around and let people run the tours and stuff, whatever.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you can say fuck, by the way. In fact, I wanted to say that was one of the things that you told me off screen on
Oh
our
yeah.
last conversation was, yeah, I wanted you to tell that story actually because you were describing how the dogs were sort of disrespected, and you said I was trying to be respectful and not say what they were saying. But could you tell me what you were telling me
Oh.
off screen?
That's
Yeah.
that reminds me of, it was one of those things that I know I didn't get it, and it's hard to just kind of blurt these things out.
Mhm.
What, like Wayne was talking about, like some of the jokes and some of the crass things you hear are kind of revealing about what was going on. And I, after it cut off, I mentioned how some of the mushers call the dogs like fuckers and cocksuckers. And
Mhm.
I have gotten to where I do it. Like I'll do it in my head. It's like, you fucker. Like I've gotten that brain worm. I actually think it's kind of funny, but it is very indicative of like that sort of thing. The you fucking cocksucker, like just some of the things you hear. You figure your life out. And one I wanted to try to shoehorn in was like when you're traveling for races, like most of the mushers kind of keep to themselves, but they'll help each other travel, and there's a bit of camaraderie there, sort of. And they they'll get to chatting, and one of the things I noticed how they like talk about women, and one of the grossest things I heard was, it made my skin crawl. I thought it was yucky, but they were talking about like another musher. He's like, oh, we got married, and he's like, he bred her yet? Like have they had kids? And that was like how oh, has he bred her yet? And I was just like, that's gross. I don't but
So it's like an example of how the culture of like using these dogs kind of seeps into the way that they treat people as well.
I don't like, I think
We're
it just
talking about.
shows that it's kind of a crass. There's a musher named Lance Mackey. He's dead. You know, I don't want to disparage it. I really wanted to talk to Lance Mackey while he was alive. And I remember hearing a podcast where he's like, anybody who thinks that this is animal abuse, I'll fly you up here myself. And I always wanted to take him up on that, but he's dead now, so I can't. But I didn't hate him. Like he's got like a movie. It's like a little documentary. And maybe like a book. But he was like addicted to meth and this kind of like eccentric dude. He survived cancer a few times. I think he's an interesting guy. I really am not joking when I say that he was probably my favorite musher, but also in that he really embodies like what the sport is. It's this kind of like gross and rough thing. Like it was a Lance Mackey quote. I don't like, it was just a story I heard about Lance Mackey where somebody saw him talk, and if you watch an interview with Lance, this totally sounds like something he would say. And it was, oh, do you breed all your dogs yourself? And he's like, oh, I used to, but then my knees gave out. This is like stuff like that, you know, just this really crass kind of yucky. Like you look at someone like Dallas Seavey, or like the guy I work for, they know that it doesn't meet society's expectations. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last one, but like Dallas Seavey has dogs everywhere. They've got like 3 or 4 properties. They've got dogs where they do you can fly out on a helicopter or whatever and do a tour on the glacier. And he's got like a dog lot where they the Alaskan like river tours and stuff, the cruises, they'll come through and they sell sled dog rides to the cruise people. And at that facility, all the dogs used to be on chains, and people thought it sucked. It was a gravel yard, and it was at like for sled dog stuff. It was pretty nice. Like people always argue about like, what is it better to have sand? Is it better to have gravel? Is it better to use just like whatever? But like it was a pretty like well maintained by sled dog standards gravel lot, and that was with dog posts and chains. And it was for the tourists at the cruise ships. And they, people don't like looking at that. So they have changed. They like shifted to like a yard and like shed system. And you can kind of tell when they're talking about it that they're not really doing it because they care. They're doing it for appearances. And it's not particularly well thought out. And they've mentioned there's fence fighting, and they're like, oh, yeah, but we've had a lot of problems like fence fighting and stuff. It's like, well, of course you have, because like this clearly is not like thought out in such a way. It's laid out to be about appearances and not about like function or anything like that. Because there are some kennel systems that are pretty good, but like nobody in America is doing them, as far as I can tell. I've never seen it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I just thought it was interesting, like you mentioned, Wayne Shung, my friend, who was talking about sort of, I think in one of our conversations we were talking about the idea of cold jokes and how they make it easier for people to commit atrocity. And I remember we were looking at Ridgeland Farms, this place where he rescued beagles from, and he told me that while they were inside there, they had all these like name tags for the beagles, and one of them was named Klutz. And we did a video about Klutz the dog, and it was just this sort of added insult. Of course, the dogs don't understand that they're being made fun of, but it's just kind of like rudeness and disrespect and demeaning language used about these dogs who didn't choose this and had no say in the matter. So when you talk about, they used to call these dogs, including you, used to sometimes get in that mindset of like, oh, fuckers and cocksuckers. It's like, it's not like hurting the dogs directly, but it's just this kind of way that they are sort of belittled even further and pushed lower on the hierarchy scale. And I think that's kind of upsetting to hear when you describe the conditions that they're placed under. And when you tell the story of someone like Olive, who collapses under the weight of all the running that she's being forced to do. And I mean, and you even talked about how Olive was like repeatedly impregnated and having to run like during pregnancies and soon after pregnancies, and just horrible conditions for these dogs. So I think for someone like you, who cares a lot about animals, it's like understandable that you got kind of sucked into the world. And of course, like, I think this is probably a pretty male driven industry, right? Like it's mostly men doing this, and men do have a way of talking when it's just men around, that they have it's like when the Trump tape came out, the infamous Trump tape, and he said, oh, that's just locker room talk, but that is a thing, locker room talk is a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess it's one thing like when things aren't meant for people to hear them, the dogs can't understand them. But I think for someone who's doing it for a living, like the person you work for, who's forcing these dogs into these situations, it's kind of like just another added insult. And yeah, and I think it's very interesting that you, as someone who really, really care about dogs, and like it like tears your heart to pieces when you're around these dogs, that I want, like, why do you think that you were in that? Were you kind of like, just like, you didn't look at it as much of a disrespect, or you were just sort of coping? Like, do you think you were coping with what was happening to the dogs in some way?
I don't know. It's just wore off on me. Like I said, I even still kind of do it, especially if it's like I have, like working with in dog training, or like I worked at a shelter. Like you deal with a lot of dogs, and like, it's just sometimes they frustrate you. You lose your patience, and like under your breath, it can be a little bit. I don't know. I think it's funny, but it's not. It's not funny. Like I'm definitely not defending it. Like I think that it's a pretty good indicator of like it would definitely like raise eyebrows. It's like if people heard that. But and then like when with me and the guy I worked for, it was often like it kind of rooted to like stemming to making fun of like a guy, but like we like a particular person who had funny mannerisms and spoke in a funny way, um but like he did that, and like he was like a celebrated guy in the. I think I sent you the interview with him. I don't.
Hmm.
He's got a unique voice. He's silly um and yeah, you know, sometimes I it probably is like a coping mechanism or something like that, because I realize it's not funny, and I still do it. I mean, I don't have any dogs around me, right? Well, but she's deaf. She couldn't hear me if I called her name anyway. But
Well, yeah. Oh, and just to jump in, like, just to be clear, I mean, you know, you might be playing with a dog or something like, you fucker, you know, like
yeah,
there's ways that it's not disrespectful, that it's just you're teasing or playing with the dog. I mean, if you love the dogs. Um,
the one
yeah,
that
I
got
just
me was the
go ahead.
musher I worked for. He said, "You got to figure your life out, bud." Like to a dog that like he bred, that's like not a good sled dog. Might have made a decent bird dog though, because
He said
I even saw him point one time, and it was like, oh my god,
he
he was
said
just
you got to
born.
figure your life out.
Yeah, you better figure your life out. Like since you're not pulling your own weight, like literally, like since you're not, you don't have a head for the sled dog
Mhm.
thing. There are dogs that just like don't.
They
People say, oh
are.
well, they're bred to do this and they love it, and it's like there's like it's a wastage. There's like so many that just don't make it, or like, and when we're talking about winning a race, it's just very arbitrary. I think if you most people, and this is true with all types of animal racing, I just think most people, like our society's, I keep saying it, society's expectation for the humane treatment of animals, and people like to think that they love animals, and I think in general people would think it's abhorrent. Like I'm in a
Mhm.
neighborhood and I've seen a bunch of people walking by with their dogs, and I think any one of these people would think it's insane. But oh, if that dog doesn't run fast enough, would you get rid of it? You know, like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But to do that over and over and over, like with these like horse people, like you know, some of these people own hundreds of horses, and they're in the best. Like
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
keep the best horse for themselves to like breed, so they can keep selling more horses. But there's like they take so much space and resources, and we know that there's like horse rescues like full of horses. There's one between you and me called Red Bell Run, and they got like 300 horses or something, 250 horses. And it's
Mhm.
like all it takes owning land and being pretty materially well off to own a horse. So where's all this like wastage coming from? It's coming from like
Mhm.
these people that, you know, we like nobody thinks they're the bad guy, and everybody tends to draw the line right below where they do things. And I know, you know, like you're in the same part of the world where there's a lot of horse people. I'm sure you probably know some horse people, and you know that you get into it because you love animals. You get into horse
Mhm.
racing because you
Mhm.
like horses. You get into
Mhm.
it's hard to forget that. And when you start applying it to people, you know, it's just hard to admit that this is like a bad cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's societal speciesism, you know, it's like societal supremacy. Like it's like I think that comment, you know, that guy made, that you better pull, you know, figure your life out to a dog is very revealing just about how um he has this expectation of the dogs to serve him, you know,
Mhm.
and that's our creation, you know, like we created that system, and it's not something they signed up for, not something they wanted to do. And yeah, and you mentioned how people will say, oh, they're bred for this. People make that same argument when they're talking about eating animals, like, oh, they're bred for that. Well, that was our choice, not their choice. They didn't get a say in that. Um, and then when you talk about this notion that they love it, like well, you're describing something that's called learned helplessness. You know, it's like um, you know, it's basically like slavery, you know, like so in submission. It's like beating someone down until, like, for instance, you when you said like you described walking in, and you showed us on the screen walking into the yard with the dogs where Olive was, and seeing how excited Olive was to see you. And of course Olive is excited to see you. You're like the one that pets her, you're the one that gives her food and that sort of thing. So you get the sense like, oh, these dogs are happy. Well, they have a miserable life. Like they get some like little joy. So if they like run a race and this is like stimulating for them, or they get like some reward or something. But there's also the other side of it. If they don't do it, they get a whipping or a beating or scolded, or I don't know, like
And a
so.
lot of people, it's a training, it's a behavioral it's called operant conditioning. And so like I hear this with barrel racers in particularly a lot. If I had a nickel for every time I've heard this from a barrel racer, oh, my horse loves to run barrels. He'll run barrels without me even on his back. And I'm like, that doesn't mean that your horse likes running barrels. That could mean that your horse is just trying to get, that could mean that your horse doesn't like running barrels and it's just trying to get it over with because it knows you're going to make it run barrels.
Right.
And it's just
Right.
operant conditioning. And then people say things like, oh, well, when I don't run my horse, or whenever the dogs don't run, they get anxious. And it's like, that's
Mhm.
because you have them on a schedule. And then whenever you break that schedule, they're like, well, what's going on? They really thrive on um that, on like having a routine. Like this old dog, my mom's dog has, or she like goes out, she like walks the fence, she comes in, and I feed her in the morning. So like every day she like scratches in my, and it's just this ancient dog. And but that's like the routine is. And if something disturbs that routine, it's gonna mess with her. And then like with animals, that's basically all they have. Like, and keeping like a horse in a stall and then taking it out to run, to do its cardio for the day, and then
Mhm.
let it hang out, put it back in the stall, wash,
Mhm.
rinse, repeat.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, that it's sort of like this Stockholm syndrome thing. Like the animals are literal slaves. Like
Yeah.
they are they are confined. They are not allowed to do certain things. They're allowed, you know, everything is decided by us. So they're literal slaves. And so any sort of joy that they're expressing is just because they don't really have any other choice. Like I mean, imagine like you were in prison, right? And then someone brought you some food. You might jump up excited to get your food or whatever, you know, but you didn't choose to be in that prison. Well, you you know, you don't want to be in that prison, you know. So
The prison analogy is really good because I mean you can just go watch any documentary about a prison, and it's like a stereotype you see in movies, like where the prisoners jeer at the person walking through. Like anytime there's like, oh, we got new blood in here, like, or like cat calling the lawyer coming. Any number of like movies have done this, but you can just observe it in real life, and it's like there's nothing going on. I think I described this at Hollywild with the parrots. Like they just want a reaction because they're bored, and it's like that's pretty
mhm.
relatable. I feel like people do that too. And
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
dogs, they're like they'll get excited for just about anything, whether they're like happy excited or bad excited. I don't. It's not even useful to pretend to know, but like
Hmm,
we
hmm.
know what's going on here, and they're being exploited.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of Wayne, he described his prison experience. He did like 38 days in jail. He said, you know, like
Oh,
after a little while, you'd hear like a door open and you rush to your little window to see what's happening because you're just so unstimulated. Um, that anything, you know, going on, you're suddenly excited about. It's not dissimilar from what happens to these animals. Uh, but yeah, it's really sad to me. It's really sad. Um, yeah, what is um, you know, in the years that you left the sled dog racing industry, you seem to have felt this real responsibility to get the word out, to speak out for these dogs. And it's been years now. You're years on out of the industry, I think, at this point. So, what is it that's still driving you to like make these reach outs, like you reached out to me? Um, what is it that keeps you going and it keeps you thinking about this? Because you've been separated from it for a while, but it still seems to be very heavily on your mind.
I don't know. That's a tough one. Because I'm not a particularly driven or motivated individual, and I don't just want like vengeance or just like against like the musher I work for. I realize it's a much bigger problem than that. I feel like I'm living in the twilight zone or something all of a sudden after, you know, like whenever I worked at Hollywild and like other stuff, I could I would get up in front of like hundreds of people and talk about like animals and have their undivided attention, and people are like really happy to hear about it. I know that people love animals and want what's best for them, but I with these issues where it comes to actually improving uh, quality of life and standards for them, they just like don't seem to go anywhere. And I've just seen that over and over and over. I've been to so many places, and I've just kind of, and I'm not a unique case. There's been so many people just like me who've just kind of, you see these sad stories accumulate. I hundreds and hundreds of animals that I've seen come and go, and I wonder about where they are. I know where they are. They ended up, and it wasn't that good. And with dog sled racing, it's just so egregious. It's just so egregious. Like you have like the Disney movies and stuff on one side, and Teacher on the Trail from Iditarod, and like all these things. Like there's like kids content on YouTube for that's like dog racing kids content. Like look how wholesome it is that we're out here racing these dogs. It's just like it's not educational. I think there's a lens. I think it certainly is a good lens to use to look at history, but just being like, oh, well, like whitewashing it and ignoring the bad parts and stuff. Um,
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
And there is no one else
glamour.
doing it. I mean, there are other people. You have people like Ashley Keith, and then you have people like PETA, and there's been a lot of other whistleblowers like me. I'm just, um, you know, I don't, maybe it really did do a number on me psychologically. I was like I said, I've just felt like I've been living in the twilight zone. Like
Yeah, yeah.
everything's just backwards. But um, I mean, compared to some of this, I know that compared to some of the stuff like the Beagles, like even when I was working in dog sled racing, I was like, well, how are other people keeping large numbers of dogs? And of course, I found my way to the Beagles for lab testing. I'm like, oh, this is worse actually. Like, and it, I don't, I don't know, but
Yeah,
it's just been really hard to let go of it.
well, you're describing some, I'm sure you've come across this maybe on Wayne's channel or my channel or my discussions with Wayne, but he talks about this concept of the green pill. I think it was Ezra Klein who coined the term, the green pill, but it's just describing basically when people go vegan. And we haven't even talked about like veganism and stuff, but when people go vegan, they feel like oftentimes they feel like they've taken the green pill, where they experience this like world shifting, paradigm shifting experience where suddenly everything that they've been doing suddenly has this like evil tint to it. It's really mind altering, and it can be frustrating because so for one, like you described this sort of cruel irony that a lot of people are coming to these zoos, right? Or a lot of people working with these animals do it because they actually love animals. And so people are supporting industries that harm animals because they love animals. And that's what one of the things that a lot of people don't realize. Like even Wayne in my discussions, I think it was Wayne, could be someone else. I'm getting people mixed up, but they were describing, you know, how when they were a kid, they were such an animal lover that they would go to the zoo all the time before realizing, oh, zoos are exploiting animals. Um, and you know, I mean, you're one of those people who was working with animals and loved animals. So it's like this, the term we hear a lot is the cognitive dissonance and just this kind of weird speciesist behavior. It even happens like, so for instance, here's another example, and I'm kind of rambling here. The new Avatar movie, which was really interesting. So James Cameron, the director, is known for being plant-based, maybe, you know, like a vegan guy.
I
Made
didn't
this
know
like,
that.
yeah, James Cameron. So he made this movie, Avatar. I'm sure most people have seen it. And the second one was very interesting because it was sort of almost like my hat, like Paul Watson, the guy who founded Sea Shepherd. It was almost like watching Sea Shepherd because it was like people, you know, going after illegal whaling. Like that was basically the theme of the second Avatar was stopping whaling.
Huh.
And in
I
that,
had no idea. Well, I know what I'm watching
well,
later.
yeah, the second one, like I mean, I don't know the entire movie, but a lot of the scenes towards the later part of the movie were sort of like anti-whaling messages. But in that same movie, there's this scene where it's like glamorizing fishing because like the guy has his son and they're like in a little pond and he's fishing and it's meant to be this like wholesome scene. So on the one hand, they're talking about how terrible it is to do whaling. On the other hand, they're saying, oh, it's fine if you just like kill this fish in this little pond. And yeah, it was like sort of over glamorizing, I don't know, like an indigenous lifestyle or something. And it just, yeah. So the frustration that you feel in these when you just see like how it did a number on your mind, like how you feel like you're living in the twilight zone. I feel that every single day, just like
No,
going
I
about my
bet.
business.
I
Well, it's
bet.
just like it's a very weird thing. I mean, even you know, going through the grocery store, or talking to people, or you know, even having conversations about animals. You'll be literally playing with dogs while people are talking about the chickens they raise for eggs and stuff, and you're like, this is just a fucked up thing. Yeah, just but it's really hard to get through that we have built a society around using animals and it's so big and so massive and so culturally ingrained that that's the point of these channels is to somehow try to make a little dent in this speciesist world that we've created. Um, so it's really helpful when someone like you, who's like spent time in the industry, comes forward on one of these industries. And you know, you had talked about Hollywild, and so you spent time there. You spent time in the sled dog industry. Um, when you go through these industries and you can kind of shed a light on some of the things that are happening in them, it's very valuable. Um, but yeah, we have to somehow break through. The way that we look at animals and even I've seen in some, I'm sorry to ramble, I've even seen in some pretty forward looking interviews just the idea of how language contributes. Like for instance, we often during our conversation sometimes we call animals it, and instead of using it we should say like maybe them or they or something, because when we
You're right.
use it just kind of like it's very unconscious thing that we do. It's very just it just rolls right off the tongue, but it kind of helps to like lower animals a little bit on that spectrum, just a little bit more to where they're like a little they're less a being and more property. And so yeah, that's one of those things that you mentioned PETA a lot, and PETA will often take a lot of flack for mentioning like little things that we do with our language. Like people were mocking PETA years ago, I remember, for suggesting that we stop using language like kill two birds with one stone
Oh,
and
I
offering
love that.
alternatives. Yeah,
It's feed two birds with one scone.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
what they
exactly.
offered, and I love that. I actually use that one. I just think it's cute. I just like that.
Yeah, it is
Feed
cute.
two birds with one scone.
Yeah, and of course they got mocked for that. But they actually bring up a really good point that they're, it's just so, when you think about all the little phrases that we have, get off your high horse, I mean, I can't think of them all right now, but so many of our sayings are something about how we use and demean animals. Um, yeah, I know. I just go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say is I was thinking about that your question about like what kind of made me and I do care about animals and I want to create a better world for animals, but I think a lot of these attitude like it's um what like in your interviews with Liesel, and then you have people
Mhm.
like uh I'm so bad with names, but this is definitely an idea that people have put out there that if you're willing to treat animals this way, you're willing to treat uh, people this way. And you look at
Yeah,
like how the workers in the meat packing industry are treated, and like I very much care about animals, but um, one of my motivating factors is that as much as frustrated and I'm pretty antisocial. I don't talk to a lot of people. I don't go out a lot. I keep to myself. But I don't like dislike people. I want to create a better world for animals and my neighbors and just
mhm.
my fellow humans and every other living creature on this planet. We got to try to figure out how to do it. And that was just there's so many jobs and stuff where you feel like you're just contributing to the problem, and
Mhm.
that's eaten away at me, and that's a big part of why I haven't been able to let it go. Is just I see it as emblematic, and it's just the one thing that I can do because it's something that I've seen. So it's nobody's job but mine to tell what I've
Mhm.
seen.
Well,
Sorry to go back to
yeah,
that.
no, my conversation with Lisa Lapel, who was someone who grew up in Germany and learned that her parents were Nazis and rejected that. And she was included in this book called Eternal Treblinka, which was drawing the links between animal agriculture and the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. And it, yeah, oftentimes there are precursors to harming animals that come to harming people that come from harming animals. For instance, the Holocaust was very much inspired by the Chicago stockyards. They looked at the meat industry in Chicago at the time and were inspired by the industrialization and the way that they had created these conveyor belts and this system that got the job done so quickly that they took inspiration from that to create the gas chambers for Jews. Um, and that book also, that's a great book, Eternal Treblinka. It also just documents how many times throughout history that we've compared humans to animals with our language, which should be a beautiful thing. But instead, what it does is oftentimes it's meant to demean, to dehumanize, and it often presages an atrocity like the Holocaust or something. I mean, there's vast number of examples where some dictator has used words like vermin, scum, rats, roaches, whatever to describe their adversaries or whoever they're about to commit some atrocity to. Um, and so, yeah, like you described, if we had a world where instead of viewing animals as so far beneath us, we would disarm that attack because I mean, yeah, I had this conversation with my friend Michelle too. And yeah, I'm not sure if Michelle like really agreed with me, but I was saying, yeah, if you had this world where um, the first thing you were taught is to respect all life, all beings, and you didn't have this weird distinction between, oh, we're gonna pet our dogs, but it's okay to eat this bacon, and that's a pig, it would be much harder for us to discriminate against people based on their gender, based on their race. It just wouldn't flow logically in my view. So yeah, the way that we treat animals is directly causing, I think, our degradation as a species as well. I mean, there's many examples of that. It's just like harmful to our health. It causes us to be cold and mean. And yeah, you described slaughterhouse workers. They suffer from PTSD. They have so many examples where they, I don't want to generalize, but there's many examples where they'll go home and take out their frustrations on a partner or something. And yeah, and then that's why I honed in on what you were talking about, that guy's joke about, oh, he married that woman. Did he breed her? Because even though that was just a meaningless, it was meaning to be a joke. I know that, but and oftentimes jokes are harmless, but they can be revealing as to somebody's mindset. So I don't want to overstate it or make that a bigger deal than it is, but it is sort of a window into the thinking of that person. And so, yeah, here's a question for you. And I don't know if this happened to you at all, but do you think that when you, for instance, when you were calling the dogs fuckers and cocksuckers and stuff like that in your jokey way, and I don't mean to harp on that because I know you didn't mean harm by it, but do you think that it changed how you interacted with animals or people? Did it have any kind of effect like that? And I'm probably grasping at straws here, so I don't know.
I certainly have had I've bounced from a couple of jobs since I got out of there, and it certainly has that's certainly possible. I wouldn't discount it. I know I'm not free from the effects of this, and I know that I think I've suffered from some compassion fatigue, and
compassion fatigue.
Yeah, that's one there's a podcast just for anybody listening. I think it's called the Compassion Fatigue Podcast, and it's made primarily aimed at animal care workers who are euthanizing animals in shelters. It's good. It's a good listen, and it's not some big podcast, but that's one that a lot of people face. It's not unique to animal care workers. That's one that nurses and caregivers and prison anybody who's working in a job where they're supposed to be helping people.
Yeah.
Or helping anyone.
Yeah, I still remember this conversation I had with a guy I knew who worked in the ER, and I was like, this is long before I was animal rights person, but I remember asking him, how do you get through it? It's just, he's working overnight, so he's getting all the gunshot victims, he's getting all seeing horrible things, and he said, I just have to look at them like they're meat, like they're pieces of meat, and that's literally how he got through it. Yeah. And that's not, honestly, that's not dissimilar from the cold jokes thing either, because the cold jokes concept is also sort of that coping mechanism to sort of get through and not have to deal with the severity of the issue that you're dealing with or the situation you're dealing with.
Yeah, it can be for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I want to make sure that we're not missing things because I remember at the end of our conversation last time that you had said, we just scraped the surface. We haven't really gotten into a lot of the stuff that I wanted to get through. And I just want to make sure that we give you that chance to go through some of this stuff. Not to say we can't always have more conversations, but what are we missing from this story that, would sort of help to illuminate it more for people?
Oh man, like I said, I wish I could just beam my thoughts directly into everybody's heads, but I think it's definitely important to know that all animal racing works the same. I think you mentioned horse racing once, and we know that they had horse racing in these like coliseums back in like Greek and Roman time, and people died. I mean, they had like like slaves running the chariot. They were very dangerous events. That for the horses died, people died. They were these like it's just always been ugly, and there isn't really a way to like. There isn't a good version of animal racing. There's just not a way to regulate it or fix it. And then as far as the history goes, I encourage people to look into that because there really is a lot of like I said, if you want to look at the whole thing with the resettlement of indigenous people in Canada and the RCMP sled dog killings, that's one. And then I think I sent you a copy of My Dogs in the Northland by Ryerson Egerton Young. And that's just like a really fascinating cultural artifact about like a white dude like in an Arctic village and like just talking shit and basically being racist. And he's talking about how he wishes he had some of his dogs. He wish he had he wished he had one of his hounds from back home. He didn't like the indigenous dogs. They're too mischievous and wily. It's a wild book. Like it's okay. But there's a lot of little rabbit holes to go down, and like even the Antarctic expeditions, you can see how those dogs were treated as like literal fuel for the expedition, where whenever they were running out of food and stuff, and if the dog was they killed and ate the dogs. Like and they talk about how it was hard on their morale and they didn't want it, like blah 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 blah. But like that was basically the plan going in. They're like, well, you can always eat the dog, right? Like they knew that going in. And so like, especially with the Iditarod, it's whenever I have a really tough time articulating this, and maybe anybody watching this will be able to pick up what I'm putting down about how this modern version of the fastest sled dogs, the dogs that can go the farthest, this is all a modern invention. Like that type of racing no indigenous community needed to travel 150 miles in a day. Like they weren't traveling 1,000 miles. That is so far. That it isn't 1,000 miles from here to New York City, and I'm in South Carolina. Like that's like on dog, and they do it in like 7 days. It's insane. That entire pushing it to the extreme and like the checkpoints is all just kind of like a monument, and it's more of like a sportified version of like that trapping and keeping the tabs on the indigenous communities, like the NW, the Northwestern Mounted Police back in the before the proliferation of snowmobiles and stuff would go to these communities and get census data and blah blah blah, but they were doing it on dogs in the winter months. And so they would go from like village to village, take some meat, feed the dogs, go to the next village. So these like long distances, this whole like it's all either like a version of like that long distance like RCMP or like that expedition stuff. It's like what the long distance thing is. And then the sprint like I was working in is more in line with the history of like trapping and stuff. But like any direction you dig into the history, it's like really ugly and none of it's really good. And I don't know if it makes sense. I've never really had anybody to bounce this off of, that it's all just kind of a monument to this, to the colonialization and like the loss of the way of life that it existed in the North for 10,000 years or longer. Like I said, I'm out of my depth trying to articulate this stuff, but maybe somebody got it.
Yeah, I would be too. I mean, neither of us are historians or anything, but I can speak broadly. I think you pointed out something important, how it's like it's extreme. Like we're talking about, we just watched the Olympics, right? And like we're celebrating these amazing achievements by athletes, but when it comes to sled dog racing, it's achievements by animals who didn't choose to participate in this. And it's very weird because like the glory, you know, is always the human's glory. And like I heard I spent a lot of time on my channel kind of ranting about NPR, my former employer, and I heard another egregious example of their supremacist coverage. Like I heard they did this story about this rodeo team down in Florida.
Oh no.
And they didn't even mention one time the harm to animals or even a modicum of concern for animals in this sport. But what they did was to have these rodeo guys talking about, oh, it's a real dangerous sport. My buddy got his neck broken, his back broken, but you know, we just power through. And I'm thinking about all these animals getting hurt and their necks broken and snapped. And we just even saw a pretty egregious example of that up in Calgary the last few weeks, where a guy just snapped the neck of a calf, like as part of the sport.
Yeah, like calf roping.
Yeah. Just grabbed the calf and just pulled his, you know, in just this horrible thing. And this is a sport, and it's disgusting. And yeah, and so it's another, that's one of those green pill moments where I'm like, NPR, you guys are supposed to be so forward thinking and progressive and on it, but you can't even recognize what you're doing. You're doing something disgusting. You're celebrating this animal abuse, and you're letting these guys like get away with talking about how dangerous the sport is for them. And it's like, fuck you, dude. I don't care about you. You're abusing animals.
Rodeos, man. Those are the ones that we could do a whole episode about rodeos. I don't have much experience with that, but like whenever I worked at Hollywild, I carried a rope, like, and I practiced throwing a rope. Like I can throw a rope. I'm not like really good at it, but I did use the rope. I did use the rope to catch animals that would like escape and stuff, but I never had to throw it. I never had to like, I never had to make it like a big thing. Like you can kind of lure them over and drape it over their head. There's other ways to do that. The rope is like stiff. Right. It hurts. And it's just a stressful thing to do it. Like for handling animals, carrying the rope is useful, but I would, as a caregiver, like even as a farmer, there really isn't much reason to be like throwing the ropes like that. That is just straight animal abuse. It is stressful. Yeah. It does hurt them. There's just like it's the old way. I was like, no, it's not. It's not the old way. Oh,
yeah. When
rodeos, man.
I know when done correctly, it's hurting the animal. I mean, like you'd have to be like really cold-hearted and just in complete denial to see like a calf running, get its, something thrown around its neck and yanked back to the
exactly.
And
like I carried the rope, and I would never throw it. I was like, why would you do that? I'm supposed to be caring for these animals, and if I throw this rope, it's just going to startle it. It might hurt. It's just going to make them run away. They're already like wanting to get out and eat the grass on this side of the fence instead of that side of the fence. So like, let's just try to get the critter back to where it needs to go. And it can be, we don't have to use violence or force, or we don't have to use more force than necessary. I guess I'm still using force with walking up and gently putting the rope on the.
Well, I mean, you're describing a situation where we're using animals, exploiting animals, and at least in your case, you were someone who cared about animals enough to not hurt them more so than what the entire thing is doing to them. But you described in our last conversation that like one of your tipping points, or one of the things that you saw on your way out of the industry, was a dog with a collar that was too tight on their neck, and so they had markings. I think even like it was just so tight, and so we're describing kind of the same.
Well, they'll all have rubbing. Like they'll basically all get that, because unless they're like really furry, but like from having if they're on a chain like that, just it rubbing is going to rub the thing. And that's one of the, thinking back about Socks having those prongs sticking into his neck, or with Blue, him tightening the collar. I don't have a dog. I might have one somewhere, but not around here. But like these collars, that's definitely one time where I should have put my foot down and be like, no, this is unacceptable. And I should have called the police like right then. But it was one of those things where I just was like, I just wasn't, part of it was me thinking about myself being like, well, what am I going to do? Like, I can't, like, this is where I live. So there was a little bit of a survival element to it, but I know that I could have figured something out. I could have, but, and then like, I try to justify it in my head all sorts of ways. Like, oh, well, I'm not really mad at Jake. I'm mad at, racing in general. I realize that he's definitely not one of the worst ones, but he's awful. And so, there's all these ways that I tried to justify it, but I know that I didn't do it right. And that's part of why I have so much respect and admiration for a lot of the people that you've interviewed, you and Wayne have interviewed, and just the amount of conviction you have. And I want to be more like that.
Yeah, I'm inspired by it too.
I know that I didn't do it the best way, and that there was a lot of weakness on my end. And not that you have to be the strongest person, but I know
I think we all in our lives have made like sort of bargains or whatever. I mean, even just on a day-to-day basis, like, so for instance, if you're like an animal rights activist, you want to exist in the world still, so it doesn't. So what the right thing to do would be, every person you see eating a sandwich that had meat in it or something would be to approach them and explain to them why this is wrong. That would probably be the right thing to do, but we would very quickly burn ourselves out if we were to do that with every moment of our life. So yeah, everybody's sort of making compromises throughout their life in terms of doing what they can do, but coming forward as you have as a whistleblower is a big thing that not a lot of people have had the opportunity to do. But I'm with you. Like I'm also very inspired by all the people that we've had on the show, whether on my channel or Wayne's channel. These people are like superheroes to me. I mean, they're like modern day superheroes. And that was part of the impetus for Wayne's channel, was like, we just need to tell these stories of the people who are doing these rescues, because they're fascinating stories, and people are, watching Spider-Man, or, like, we're celebrating all these fictional characters, but there's actually quite a few real life characters that are doing just as fascinating things, and we could tell those stories, and yeah, we should be telling those stories. So it's really interesting. But I mean, you're part of that story in my view, because whistleblowers are like a very vital part of this whole this whole effort, and I'm glad you feel that. I'm glad you feel that, like that that responsibility that, I need to do right by these animals. Like every time that we feel like we've like let somebody down in our past or something, we feel like we've got to right this. And I'm glad that you feel that for these animals. It speaks very highly, of us as a species, that we can have this, like we can have this compassion for animals, knowing that you're not going to get any kind of like thanks or anything. You're not going to get any kind of reward for it. In fact, you probably more so, you just could invite, problems for yourself by coming forward, but you're willing to take that chance and do it, which I think is brave. Yeah, and I think, like you said, you did actually get to that point where you may have had moments where you're thinking, where am I going to live? But you ultimately did call the police and leave. You ultimately did. I mean, maybe because he caught you talking on your thing, but you were obviously headed that direction, so it was going to happen before long. You were, yeah, I'm sorry to glaze over your story, but you said that you were basically creating a video that you were trying to expose, and the guy came home and overheard you making that video and kicked you out, I guess, at that point. Yeah. So now that you're out of the industry, do you have contacts still in the industry that you talk to at all, or are you just like completely out of that world?
No, I've mainly, well, I mean, I don't know what he would have told everybody because you drag this dude around with you for like, people would ask about the handlers. They'll be like, "Oh, well, what's your old handler doing?" And it's probably something, he's probably not going to be like, "Oh, well, he thought I was an animal abuser, so I kicked him out." Like, he's definitely not going to be like saying stuff like that.
Right. Right.
I don't
Make
know.
up some story about you, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, it was time for him to move on. It's easy enough to, I guess. So to kind of, I'm not active on Facebook, but I was friends with some of these people. So every now and again, I might go creep on some of them and see what they're doing, look at people's dog yards or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he definitely blocked me off Facebook, so I don't know what he's doing. But some of the adjacent people I could still creep on if I want to. But it's mainly just looking at their dog yards is the only useful thing really was like look at. I think I told you the story about the girl. She's like our age, around our age, and she accidentally killed her entire dog team by putting them in the dog box. It was either too hot and she got to where she was going, whatever. But like, so like that, and I know she feels bad about that, and like it really messed her up and blah blah blah. But like, I think I sent you a video of her dog yard, and it's like you can like see. And she's one of the ones where it's like a bad habit, like I don't think she's making money off of it. I think she got into it because her husband was into it and now he like works all the time, so he can't do it. And she likes it and she keeps the racing doing. And then people are, "Oh, look, wow, you're a female and you're into racing. You're one of the, oh wow, the top 3 racers at this year's state stop are all women. Like, isn't that cool?" Like that, like, yeah, I don't know. It's easy to lean into. But when you really look at it, I just feel like it's so grim.
Yeah. How do we break that bad habit that you keep mentioning?
The habit of like racing, or I don't know. I don't know. Like racing is, I mean, I think from a legislative perspective, I think, and I'm not a politics guy, but I look at how we, with the Animal Welfare Act, I think we need to add an amendment to that or something and ban animal racing, because that's basically how it's worded. I think for the racing, I mean the fighting, it bans like the like betting competition. It was like rooster, dog fighting, all that was banned at once. It's not like, it doesn't really make sense that we would have greyhound racing banned, but in the same state, like horse racing is still allowed. Like that's just incongruent legislation. So
glad you pointed that out. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I would like to do that. Like, you look at why they banned greyhound racing. I think maybe it had to do with that puritanical kind of. It had to do with the gambling, and dogs have historically been a bit more blue collar than horse stuff. But I don't know. That's like what I think like a policy to advocate for is to add an amendment to the Animal Welfare Act. But I'm not sure if that makes sense or anything.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me when we're talking about like sled dog racing, because it requires snow and the world is heating up, that they must feel the pressure of, dwindling snow, dwindling areas that they can do it.
The indigenous communities, I know, well, yeah, everybody, but some of the people can like train to. There's this famous photo of, I don't have it in front of me, it's in Greenland, and it's of like some sled dogs like on some like great glacier overflow like water stuff, and it's just like the ocean, and it's just like it's just this flat beautiful, crystal clear, like expanse of ankle deep water, and the sled dogs are like going through it, pulling the
Oh, wow.
sled through this
Gotta
bullshit.
see that
It's
photo.
wild.
That sounds
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah.
But that the
I'll have to
article
write
was
that.
talking about global warming, climate change, sled dogs, Greenland.
Mm,
You'll know it when you see it. It's like, oh, whoa.
yeah.
And that the climate change has affected those communities a lot in various ways. And uh,
Hmm.
I'm definitely not the one to talk about the
Well,
that.
it's interesting. Like, I don't want to make this too much about your employer, and so much personalized, but you did describe him as like a Democrat, and
Yeah.
someone who probably believes in climate change, cares about climate change. And I'm just wondering, like, if it was on his mind much, like, oh, maybe I'm not going to be doing this much longer. And so why is he doing it? Why does he keep doing it?
I I do think he thought that because I think he was a I mean he's clearly got a screw loose if he's like treating dogs like that. But like
Hmm.
he was like a hard worker and like he made a life for himself. Like he um mainly through exploitation of animals and people, I guess.
Yeah.
Like because he worked on a salmon boat and he basically got lucky. He was a salmon fisherman and uh you can get into that and like kind of get stuck in that. But if you have like a good season, you can get out. You can. So I think he had a good couple seasons like salmon fishing, and then he got out at the right time. And he was able to invest that.
Hmm.
Um, but um,
Let me ask you about another pressure that that industry may feel, and I'm wondering if this is uh, part of it too, because I often hear stories about how, like, for instance, the fur industry, like a lot of the people who are furriers are people who are older guys, like people who are aging out and passing away. And there aren't really that many young people that want to do this kind of thing. Is it kind of the same thing with sled dog racing? Like, are they having a generational pressure as well that's hurting them, or are there a lot of young people that are interested in it and want to do it?
there's probably a lot of young people who think they want to do it. Like
Hmm.
people typically think that like, oh wow, sled dog's cool, and like there's that whole tourist industry. I meet people pretty frequently who say it's like a bucket list thing, but
Hmm.
outside of a general kind of curiosity, I don't think it is. And it definitely is feeling that because it takes so much money and free time to do. I mean, it take the Iditarod stuff is like a huge time sink, like because you're out there for hours and hours and hours. Those dogs are so slow; they're so slow,
Hmm.
and I and even the sprint stuff takes hours and hours, and you got to feed all those dogs every day and stuff. So people just can't afford to do it. That definitely is a part of it. And I'm not sure like ever really caught on all that much. Like its heyday was in the 70s. That's whenever the most people were doing it.
Hmm.
But there is just a lot better stuff people could be doing with their time than that, I think.
In your experience, people in that industry, how do you hear them discussing animal rights activists much? Do you hear how they describe groups like PETA, that sort of thing? Like, what can you shed any light on that?
It's probably about what you would expect. Not favorable bunny hugger, all those animal rights stuff. I think I sent you an interview with him on the Dog Driver show,
Hmm.
um, which is available. It's just random musher interviews, and some of those guys are pretty cool. Some of them are not. Um, and he mentioned in that. I mean, I can tell you that I've heard people say stuff like this, but like this is
Hmm.
an example I can point to and that people could look at. And he mentions knowing the dog boxes. He mentioned how some of the mushers in New Hampshire, because there's like a lot more. We traveled in New Hampshire for Laconia, and he was talking about that on the podcast. And he mentioned how some of the musters out there mentioned that they only use like cargo trailers, like unmodified cargo trailers to travel with the dogs, because they don't want people knowing that they have sled dogs. And it's like, I think he even said it's like those animal rights people. He don't like, it's just easier to avoid people knowing that they had sled dogs. Which I never encountered that, because like people were generally kind of like, oh wow, sled dogs, like that's neat. Because we were an eyesore when we stopped. We would let these dogs out, and it's like there's like 30 dogs running around. And
well, so would you say that in your experience, does the sled dog racing industry feel much pressure from animal rights activists, or is it muted? Because I just don't see much focus on sled dog racing in the animal rights community, other than the things that you've sent me, like from PETA and stuff.
They're very aware of it. Like I said, how the musher I worked for would say things where he's aware of it. Like the dogs would be pooping blood after a race, and he would say, he would shove the shovel at me and be like, hey, quick, get that. We can't let people see stuff like that. And it's like, well, like, okay,
interesting.
Yeah, like that sort of thing. Or, I think I mentioned in the last one, well, why did you go get back in the trees and give them the old talking about whipping the dog where you can't see them? Or it coming up, like we were talking about that one dude who got in trouble at the Iditarod for hitting the dogs. His entire dog team with a trail marker. And they were like, that dumbass, like, why didn't he get back in the trees where no one can see him? Like, they're very aware of the public perception. But you're right. There isn't like many people talking about it. Like there isn't any real material pressure, no, outside of PETA. And I would like to say they feel it, but I don't really think they do.
Well, what you just described just to me is pretty interesting. Can you tell me more about the thing that happened where they were pooping blood, and can you tell me that story about how you were told to get rid of that?
That's a lot. Okay, I don't know if I mentioned this last time. There's a website called the International Sled Dog Veterinary Medical Association, and you can go on there, and they have a section called research articles, and you can read all these like kind of clinical dry like research papers about sled dogs, and it's like mad science stuff, but it's really talking about the dogs pooping blood. Like they are running so long. I feel like I would have mentioned this last time. I hope I'm not repeating myself, but they get gastric lesions and ulcerations and perforations from, well, one of the studies is called the temporal relationship between gastrointestinal protein loss and ulceration in racing Alaskan sled dogs. I think I butchered that a little bit, but that's basically what they're like. They're studying, is there a relationship between how long the dogs are running and like how much they're exerting themselves to like them pooping blood, right? Because they poop blood all the time. Like you run them a little too hard. Oops, they're pooping blood. I'll have to take it easy next time. Like I'm so used to dogs pooping blood at this point. Like, my mom came in here because I'm like the dog guy now. My mom sent me a thing like, oh, so-and-so's dog is pooping blood. I was like, it's probably fine. Like, that's not my biggest concern. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yeah. I was like, is the dog like eating and drinking? And they're like, no. I'm like, I'm more worried about that than the bloody poop. But yeah, dogs pooping blood is pretty common. But like, I've just seen so much of it in dog sled racing. It's just like all the time. And like I said, you're trying to avoid it. There's over-the-counter medications you can give them, but especially during races when people are pushing the dogs a little bit harder, that's when you're more likely to see it, and people are less likely to do it. But it's definitely a thing. The dogs be pooping blood like all the time.
So it's not a common thing for dogs in general. It's just common in this industry, is what you're saying.
Yeah, no, the only time they would be pooping blood like normally is if they had like hookworms or something like that, some sort of problem, or if they like if they were overexerting themselves for some reason. I guess other dogs could, but it would be a bad thing. But like in dog sled racing, when you're training and racing, it's something you see pretty often. The idea is
So
to
it,
avoid.
so it happens pretty often, yet
Oh
someone
yeah,
told you to please cover this up, to cover our tracks a little bit.
yeah. He was. Oh yeah, you can't let people see that. And in general, when they're running, we mentioned this a little bit last time. How human runners will run till they maybe we didn't talk about this, but human runners run and it gets things moving around and it makes them have to go to the
Mhm.
bathroom. And so the dogs aren't allowed
Yeah.
to like they're being made to poop while they run. But the other part of that is is all the like there's all that like muscle contracting and like stuff that goes in like whenever you're trying to go. There's like a lot going on down there. And whenever they're like running and they got all this stuff moving around it and it there's various factors and they were studying. It wasn't a very good test. It didn't have a good sample size. Um, Whatever, but they're there and you can kind of see like what they were looking into and like why. And that's the blood pooping thing. So it's like a well-known problem. I've got yeah. But
Yeah.
he
Go
was
ahead.
aware. He wasn't like pick up that poop so the dog doesn't step in. He was like pick up that bloody poop because he like specifically said we can't let people see that. Like he was really him in particular. He fancied himself as kind of like a representative of the sport, and
You're
so
talking about
and
your
you can see
employer?
that with like yes, and you can see that with interviews with like Dallas Seavey. He kind of does that. He always like look at. I mentioned Lance Mackey. Look at the difference between Lance Mackey, how Lance Mackey presents himself, versus how like uh, Dallas Seavey presents himself. And you can see that
Mhm.
they're trying to kind of polish up. They're kind of
Yeah.
trying to show what people say, and they want their yeah. They know it doesn't look good. It's
What else
less
are,
and less.
yeah, what else are they trying to cover up?
Well, I think I mentioned a little bit last time, and since where I work for didn't cold dogs, but there's certainly that certainly is a thing that goes on, and there are people who've talked about. There's been other handlers that have come out talking about uh, dead dogs in freezers and dog bodies poking out of snowbanks and stuff. I mean, there's like a lot when you look into it.
Mhm.
Um, that's not the sort of thing you advertise. Um,
Mhm.
but that's like I can sit here and come up with like ugly stories I've heard and like things I've seen all day. Like like Olive is a great example, but it's the system overall and like the number of dogs that like get displaced. And like I mentioned, like how Dallas Seavey has like 3 or 4 properties that he's got. I don't know. My best. Does anybody know? I don't even know if he knows how many dogs he has. But my best guess is like somewhere between 300 and 500 dogs, which spread between like 3 and 4 properties. And it's all like a closed loop. Like he has stated, it's like, oh yeah, we don't do adoptions. We don't do. It's just more trouble and it's blah 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 blah. So like I said, it's just you have to kind of. I've heard somebody say it's you have to develop a critical eye for these things and look slightly below the surface. But like, yeah, I mean, like dogs get overrun, dogs get beaten, dogs get cold. They all live on chains, like all that, and that's like definitely what I want to get across. But like, real, I mean, I definitely just want to say it's like the quality of life across the board. Even like the nicest sled dog kennels really aren't that good. The number of sled dog kennels I might give a pass, I can count on one hand. Like in the world. Like I'm sure there's more than that, but there's not that many. There's not that many sled dog kennels in the world, like at all. And
Mhm.
it it's just the generalized problem. And you can look at like I love to look like I don't like it frustrates me. I can't watch it. It's those shows like Life Up North or Yukon Men, some of that stuff like that. Some of those guys are mushers. One of them was a trapper, and like he even talks about how he doesn't like. He's not really into dogs. He doesn't like dogs. He just doesn't like snowmobile, and that's how the show posed it. It was like, oh, the son, he's into snowmobiles, but the old man likes his trusty old dogs. But he doesn't like the guy. Wasn't like a bunny hugger or anything like that. In fact, like the dogs are just tools. He uses them as tools. It's about running fast, checking a bunch of traps, and whenever the dog dies, he's got a new pair of gloves. Like that's what it. I just want to like to articulate that lineage there, and that it's just like I said, it's not on a good trajectory. It's just as far as racing goes, especially, it's just going to get faster and faster. Are you going to set an arbitrary speed limit on it? What do? You put a regulation on how many dogs people can own? Like I've heard people pitch that seriously, like, oh well, they shouldn't be able to own that many dogs. I was like, then you're just like shuffling them around more. Like that doesn't like change it. But there isn't. It's not, the trajectory isn't good, and then whenever you look back at it, it's not really good either. Like the RCMP sled dog special reports are good, and like there's any number of random videos. I found one. It was this video of an old dog breeder, and it was those white Samoyed dogs, the really fluffy ones, and it was this really old video, and it was like the Samoyed dog has life in the harsh Arctic in close proximity to frostbitten Samoyed men has instilled in them the virtues of the white man. And it's like, what? Like, what am I hearing right now? There's just like a really interesting. I've tried to put this in front of people who kind of might be able to look at some of this stuff a little bit better than me, but there is just a really grim history. And I think that people like to look at history with rose-tinted glasses. A lot of times they tend to ignore. They're all like, well, that's just the way it's always been, or like that's just the way it is. And it doesn't have to be. And I think it's important to be honest about like the way things should improve. Horses are a good example of that. Like you can see all the outdated, the bits, the whips, the spurs, the crops, but like a bit is a piece of metal you put in a horse's mouth, and it's a pain compliance device. And the Olympics are going on. All those dressage horses have metal bits in their mouth. It's a requirement. Every one of those horses has a bit in its mouth. And it's like, why? I just don't understand. Like people are saying the animals are so well cared for and they love it. They want to do it. And then why do you need the bit?
Yeah.
I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours. I'm just rambling again. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking like the whole time, like, why do we need the bit? Why do we need the animal at all? Why do we need the sport? Why do we need any of this? Yeah. And you described that you could count on like one hand the number of kennels that you would give a pass to. And even those kennels are still engaging in the sport and the exploitation and the confining and the enslavement and the idea that we're better, the idea that we're a superior species, and we just need to end all of it. And yeah, so that's why I really thank you, Mac. I think we could wrap it up here, but is there anything that I know you could go for days. Is there anything that we really shouldn't have missed that we might have?
I can't think of anything. That's the bare, but I mean, like I said, I could go on and lots of fun stories and anecdotes for you, for everybody. But I know that I might not be the one to articulate some of this stuff, and I really appreciate the chance to just kind of put that in front of people for them to stew on and maybe be able to. I encourage people to do their own research and come to their own conclusions and look at that sort of stuff. But it's a really the sled dog industry, the racing, the tourism, the shift in quality of life for indigenous people, like that really is an interesting window into so many of the problems that are going on today. And we're still feeling the effects of that stuff. Like I was saying living memory. A lot of these people who were sent to these re-education camps and had their dogs shot and were relocated and had their families tortured. They're still alive. They're still alive. Some of these, like, this is very much not ancient history. And my window into that just happened to be through the sled dogs. But
well, what I've been trying to do,
look at that.
Yeah, what I've been trying to do with these is always to give at least a few resources that people can go further if they want to dive in further. And almost all of my videos, I link to documentaries like Dominion and Earthlings, and also in the last one we linked to sled dogs. And but let's make sure that we give people some of that reading material that they can like kind of go through. And I know you sent a lot of it to me, so I'll make sure that we give people good links and stuff so that they can do that deeper dive. And yeah, I hope that people will look into this more. I know that there was like there was quite a bit of interest, you know, like compared to a lot of the videos that I've done, there was quite a bit of interest in comparison to the others as well for the sled dog racing industry. I think for the same reason that I kind of took to it too, just because I don't know much about it. And so,
yeah,
as you mentioned, that with its history being so short, it's probably something that you could bone up on pretty quickly. So yeah, let's give people those resources. But Mac, I appreciate you so much. And yeah, and like I said the last time, there's always more that we can discuss, and we can always do it again if we need to. But yeah, I just want to express my deep thanks to you for coming forward with your story and speaking out for these dogs like Olive. Like, they need you. And it's a proud legacy. Like, I know my channel has a small reach. It's not going to reach a ton of people, but hopefully it might reach the right people. And yeah, to just amplify these dogs' stories a little bit. So I thank you a lot.
Likewise, I really appreciate you giving me the chance to put this stuff out there, and I really appreciate you and what you do. Everybody who you've interviewed, but you especially for being the one to do the interviews and share them with all of us. I've been just floored by every single one of them. I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome, even being on the same list as some of these people.
No,
so
you shouldn't. Yeah, you shouldn't, because it's really fascinating, and you have a lot to say. So yeah, never feel like you shouldn't speak up, you know, because you have a lot to say. Yeah, speak with confidence too. I know you kind of sometimes you'll doubt yourself, say, well, I'm not a historian. Well, me neither. Like, I don't have any credentials really. So I'm just going for it.
Oh, you do though.
No. Well,
you really come across like as like I said, it's very apparent that you used to work in radio, just in the way you.
Maybe we should go another hour.
If that makes sense.
You're praising me. We can go a little longer.
Oh, I could praise you for an hour. I mean, I have been floored. It was your advice, and it was in one of your conversations. I don't remember which episode in particular. That was why I sent you the email. It was basically.
Oh wow.
Because you told me to. You know, you said
nice.
You need to do actives, and I was listening. Since you're right up the road, I felt a little bit of a kinship there.
Nice, yeah.
But it was I was just following your advice. So I know not to beat myself up too much or anything.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. I know you're not doing that.
It really is. Yeah, and so one thing I think might be interesting to, if anybody wants to look at this, is I mentioned I'm probably butchering the name, the Qikiqtani Truth Commission. And
yeah,
I discovered that they had a YouTube channel today. And I mean, if anybody reads the PDF of it that we'll link down below, you'll realize it's some pretty heavy stuff. And I found that they had a YouTube channel today where like half the videos are in their native language, and then the other 4 are like translated. And like the channel only has 6 subscribers, 7 subscribers.
Oh my
Like
God.
nobody watches this stuff, man. And even some of the sled
Mhm.
dog videos, like the most watched sled dog video, like I really think if more people could see it, just knew what was going on, I really think that
Yeah.
it wouldn't be like that. But this is more of a history type thing. They talk about the sled dog killings in it.
Mm.
But I think that would be a good one to link down below. These videos are like 10 years old too. I just noticed that nobody watched it, and it's like
Yeah.
incredible stuff. And
Mm.
maybe it'd
I
be
know
cool if
it's
you
so
could link that one.
depressing. So
Oh,
depressing, right? I mean, I know I'll go back to a lot of these times I'm looking for like a PETA expose or something, an investigation. I'll go back and I'll see how few people watched it, how few people liked it. Oh yeah, and for anybody watching, I haven't been mentioning this on my channel, but if you're watching the channel, if you could give me a subscribe and like the video, that helps out a lot as I'm trying to grow the channel. A little bit of self-serving plugs there, but yeah, it does help out the channel a lot. But yeah, all these like old investigations and stuff, like they need views, and that's why people don't see them. It's like somehow like they go out there and just they just fly under the radar. I wish YouTube or whoever it is that controls these algorithms would boost these things up instead of like, don't show me the entertainment stuff all the time, the stuff that we don't need. Just show me sometimes what I need to see. Yeah, so depressing. I mean, it's like I'm going to go off on a tangent. I know I'm going to try to wrap it up here, but I just want to also say that I'm really grateful to YouTube for having Earthlings and Dominion on YouTube. Um, and that's great. And I wish they would push it to more people. But I was talking to James Aspey, this activist from Australia, and I was asking him, why isn't something like Dominion on Netflix or something like that? And he said, well, I think it was just too brutal for them to show it on Netflix. And if we could just get some of these, some of this stuff, it's just like what you described. If this stuff can get in front of people, it will end, because these industries exist because people don't know that it's happening. It's just like that guy saying, pick up that bloody poop. We can't let people see that. Well, if people saw that, then they would start to question, maybe this isn't great for these dogs. So, all right, Mac. Well, it's great to talk to you again, and let's stay in touch. Thank you,
all
buddy.
right, definitely. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time. I was really nervous
Absolutely.
going into this, but I feel like it was a great conversation. Thanks again.
Yeah, no doubt.